A journey of friendship, cooperation, and peace. That's how Chinese President Xi Jinping described his recent trip to Moscow to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China and Russia have grown increasingly close to one another, much to the chagrin of Western powers. It wasn't supposed to be this way. When Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Western countries triggered some of the harshest sanctions in history against the Russian Federation. Russia's banks were cut off from SWIFT, the international payment system that keeps currencies flowing from country to country. In an unprecedented move, the G7 countries, the Western countries with the largest economies, seized the assets of Russia's central bank, essentially taking $300 billion from the bank's accounts. Not much later, Visa and MasterCard withdrew from the country, denying Russians the ability to use the world's most common credit cards. And pretty soon, Western businesses were closing up shop and leaving Russia. 30 years earlier, the opening of a McDonald's restaurant in Moscow was one of the most powerful symbols that the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union had come to an end. When McDonald's pulled out of Russia in May of 2022, it was another powerful symbol that the old conflict was back in a new form. All those sanctions were meant to cripple Russia's economy and its currency, the ruble. In the words of President Joe Biden, the sanctions were meant to turn the ruble into rubble. The early forecasts for Russia's economy were dire. Economists predicted its GDP would shrink by 7 or 8%, with some forecasts calling for as much as a 15% decline. That would have meant that Russia would have fallen into an economic depression. But that didn't happen. Russia's economy shrank by between 2.1 and 2.6% in 2022, depending on whose numbers you use. That's bad, but not nearly the crisis that Western experts had been expecting. And recently, the IMF surprised analysts when it predicted that Russia's economy is set to grow in 2023 by around 1.5%. It has since revised its forecast and now says Russia will grow 0.7% this year. That's not huge growth, but a far cry from the economic collapse people were expecting. Things have not turned out for Russia the way the West was expecting, and one reason for that is a major new player on the world stage, China. So what has Russia been doing that has allowed it to avoid economic catastrophe, at least so far? And how is China involved? In this video, we'll answer these questions, but before we do, make sure to subscribe to our channel to get notifications on all our latest news and analysis. And if you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. The first thing to understand is that when Western sanctions against Russia kicked in, the country reacted very quickly, and in ways designed to minimize disruption to the Russian economy and Russians' way of life. It wasn't entirely successful, but it did work to an extent. The Russian central bank raised its base interest rate to 20%. That was a shock to Russia's economy, but it also made the ruble an attractive investment because you could now earn 20% on Russian ruble deposits versus 3 or 4% on euro or US dollar deposits. The central bank also froze foreign currency accounts and put in some restrictions on currency conversions. In other words, it became very difficult to pull money out of Russia or sell rubles for other currencies. All of this protected the Russian ruble from a total collapse. At the same time, Vladimir Putin's government began to arrange for assets of Western companies that left Russia to be taken over by Russian oligarchs. In one of the most famous examples, Alexander Govar, a construction investor who owns an oil refinery in Siberia, took over the 850 McDonald's locations in Russia, rebranding it as Vkuzno i Tochka, Russian for delicious, full stop. Vkuzno i Tochka serves a menu that looks a lot like the old McDonald's menu, and even its logo is reminiscent of the McDonald's M. This has been Russia's strategy, to recreate the Western brands that once operated in the country, but with Russian ownership. Something like this has also happened with Visa and MasterCard. When the two major credit card companies left Russia, they were replaced by Mir, a payment system Russia's central bank had set up in 2017. But Mir wasn't widely accepted outside Russia. That, combined with the fact that Russia's major banks were cut off from the SWIFT payment system, meant Russians largely couldn't travel abroad because they didn't have access to money or credit outside of Russia. So Mir struck up a deal with UnionPay, a Chinese payment system that's accepted in dozens of countries including Spain, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Panama, and Singapore. Some ATMs in France and the US accept UnionPay cards as well. Russians could once again travel, at least to the countries where UnionPay is accepted. This is just one example of how Chinese companies and the Chinese government have helped to bail out Russia amid Western sanctions. But a much more important example has to do with oil. When Russia was cut off from selling oil and gas to Western countries, especially Europe, the largest market for Russian energy. The country quickly pivoted to Asia and started selling oil to Asian nations at a discount to global oil prices. Asian countries lapped up the cheap Russian oil. In the first half of 2023, China's imports of Russian oil were 11.7% higher than a year earlier and more than 15% above where they were in pre-COVID times. And China wasn't the only one. India, which hadn't traditionally bought much Russian oil, began buying huge amounts of it, and in 2022, it bought 10 times as much Russian oil as the year before. In the space of 1 year, Russia replaced the Middle East as the largest supplier of oil to India. All of this new trade with Asia helped prop up the Russian ruble. At the beginning of the Ukraine war, the ruble slid drastically, losing nearly half its value. But once the central bank's currency controls were in place and trade with Asia began to take off, the ruble soared to levels much higher than where it was before the war. With all this new trade going on, Russia's current account surplus swelled to a record high. In 2022, Russia's current account surplus with the rest of the world was the equivalent of $227 billion US dollars. This means $227 billion more flowed into Russia than flowed out of it. That's the highest on record and an 81% increase from the year before. Russia's pivot to Asia and its new financial partnership with China paid off massively. And no wonder, Asia is the world's fastest growing region economically. According to the IMF, 70% of the world's economic growth in 2023 will happen in Asia. Russia's success in the face of sanctions was a thorn in the side of the Western powers. These countries began implementing new measures to stymie Russia's economy, and that set off a tit-for-tat economic war between the West and Russia. In June of 2022, the European Union and Great Britain introduced a new rule that banned insurance companies from insuring oil tankers that carried Russian oil. Most of the international insurers that insure oil tankers are based in the EU or the UK, so this meant that pretty much all oil tankers carrying Russian oil couldn't get insured. But Russia and its business partners found a way around it. Shipping companies that do business with Russia started buying used oil tankers to build a shadow fleet that would carry oil, sometimes under falsified papers and using fake names. It wasn't all that hard to do. There was already an existing shadow fleet carrying oil from other sanctioned countries, such as Iran and Venezuela. Now Russia has joined the club. It's a risky way to do business. These ships travel uninsured, meaning that if they sink or run aground, the buyers and sellers of the oil they're shipping could be in serious financial trouble. But oil is in such high demand that there are still plenty of buyers who are willing to take the risk. So the West once again raised the stakes. In December of 2022, the G7 countries instituted a price cap on Russian oil of $60 per barrel. With oil trading between $80 and $100 per barrel in recent times, this was a huge discount for Russian oil. Under this policy, an oil tanker carrying Russian oil could be insured, but only as long as the selling price of that oil was below $60. The idea was to prevent an energy crisis by allowing Russian oil to keep flowing, but to limit the profits that Russia makes off that oil. This time, the sanction seems to have worked. As the price of Russian oil dropped to $60 per barrel, the country's massive trade surplus began to shrink. Before the price cap, Russia was running a monthly trade surplus of around $16 billion to $30 billion per month. Since the price cap, it has fallen to around $7 to $10 billion per month. That has had an impact on the Russian government's revenue, which was heavily dependent on oil and gas exports. Income from oil exports has fallen by half, even as the government's expenditures have grown by nearly 60% because of the war. That, in turn, has caused a decline in the ruble. Since it peaked in October of 2022, the ruble has fallen 36% against the US dollar. The latest decline came after the near coup in Russia in late June, when mercenaries from the Wagner Group attempted a rebellion against the Russian military. The ruble is now trading well below the levels it was at before the war. In this way, Western countries hope to bankrupt the Russian government, forcing it to end the war in Ukraine. But it would take years of this to bankrupt Russia, and lately, signs have been emerging that the strategy is faltering. In July of 2023, the average price of Russian oil on the markets rose above the $60 price cap. This means that the shadow fleet of black market oil tankers is working, and buyers of Russian oil are willing to take the risk of buying oil this way. If oil buyers get used to this way of doing business, Russia could once again start making large profits off its energy exports. Western countries may need to find yet another tool in their economic war against Russia. In the meantime, Russia has found ways around the sanction that prevent it from buying material for its war effort. A group of former Soviet republics, countries that border Russia, have become transshipment hubs for goods flowing into Russia. Armenia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan are buying microchips and other goods needed for Russia's war effort and selling them on to Russian companies. These countries are buying about 40% more goods from the US and EU than they were before the war began, and their exports to Russia have jumped by 50%. But the single biggest foreign contributor to Russia's war effort is China. Trade between Russia and China, the world's second largest economy, has jumped by more than 40% since the start of the Ukraine war. And the US government recently declassified a report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence saying that China is sending equipment to Russia that can be used by the military. Chinese companies are shipping navigation equipment, jamming technology, and fighter jet parts to sanctioned Russian government-owned defense companies. The report also indicated that Russia is buying microchips for supercomputers from China by way of shell companies set up in Hong Kong. In short, the West underestimated Russia and overestimated its own power. When it stepped into the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it didn't take into account the rapid rise of Asia as an economic power. A generation ago, it would have been unthinkable that Russia would be able to replace its trade with the West with trade with Asia. But today, it's entirely possible. And with tensions growing between China and the West, Chinese President Xi Jinping is working to form military and economic alliances that will allow his country to be less dependent on trade with the US and Europe. And China is finding many willing partners. When the US and EU seized the Russian central bank's assets, many national leaders realized that their own country's foreign currency reserves aren't actually their own. They could be taken away at any time by the Western powers. Now these politicians are looking for an alternative to dependency on the West, and they're finding it in China. This month, members of the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, will meet in Durban, South Africa. On their agenda will be a massive expansion of this club of countries. There are reportedly some 40 countries around the world who want to join the BRICS, including Argentina, Iran, Cuba, and perhaps most significantly, Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer. Another item on the BRICS agenda will be a proposal to create a new global trade currency to replace the US dollar. If these efforts succeed, we may see the creation of a new bipolar world, with the US and Europe leading one side and China and Russia leading the other. And if that happens, then history may remember the war in Ukraine as the opening salvo of a new and very dangerous Cold War. If you liked this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.